Hey, stop scrolling for a second. A man got down on one knee in the middle of a crowded rooftop restaurant and slid a $10 million ring onto the hand of the woman he loved. It should have been the happiest night of her life. What she didn't know was that his ex-fiancée was standing 30 feet away, watching the entire thing from the shadows near the bar. And she had a reason for being there that had nothing to do with jealousy. I'm not going to tell you what that reason was. Not yet. Just stay with me, because this one isn't the story you think it is. Hi everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from today. I love reading where you all are. This is a story about assumptions, second chances, and the difference between someone who wants revenge and someone who's just trying to protect you from something you can't see yet. So settle in, because this one turns fast. Leo Marchetti was 34, the founder of a fintech company that had gone from a two-person startup to a name most people in banking recognized within 6 years. He was intense about his work and surprisingly private about everything else. A man who preferred quiet dinners to galas even after his company made him wealthy enough to never think about money again. I'm Ren. I'm the one this happened to, so I'll tell you the parts I actually lived through myself. I'd been with Leo for 2 years by the night of the proposal. We'd met at a mutual friend's gallery opening, and what pulled me toward him wasn't the company or the money. It was how carefully he listened, like every word actually mattered to him. I knew in a general way that he'd been engaged once before to a woman named Ingrid, and that it had ended a year or so before we met. He didn't talk about it much, and I didn't push. Everyone has a chapter they'd rather not reread out loud. The proposal happened at a rooftop restaurant downtown, a place with a wraparound view of the skyline that Leo had rented out a private section of for the evening. I thought it was just a nice dinner to celebrate a deal his company had closed that week. I had no idea what was actually happening until he was down on one knee in front of me, holding a ring that, I'd learn later, was worth more than most houses. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. What I didn't notice, because I was crying and laughing and completely absorbed in the moment, was a woman standing near the far end of the bar, half hidden behind a large potted plant, watching us with an expression that, according to my best friend Priya, who did notice, looked less like heartbreak and more like barely contained urgency. That woman was Ingrid. I didn't find out until the next morning, when Priya called me, hesitant, and asked if I'd noticed anyone watching us the night before. I hadn't. She described her, tall dark hair, a green dress, and something cold settled in my stomach, because that description matched a photo I'd once stumbled across on Leo's old phone, years earlier, of the woman he used to be engaged to. Why would she be there? I asked Priya, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. I don't know, Priya said, but she didn't look like someone trying to ruin a proposal. She looked like someone trying to get close enough to say something and losing her nerve every time she almost did. I didn't tell Leo right away. I sat with it for 2 days, turning it over, imagining every version of the story, that Ingrid was still in love with him, that she was there to make a scene and lost her courage, that it meant nothing at all, and Priya had simply misread a stranger's face across a crowded restaurant. Eventually, the not knowing became worse than whatever the truth might be, so I told him. Leo went very still when I described her. Green dress? Dark hair about my height? That's what Priya said. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He picked up his phone and, in front of me, called a number he clearly still had saved. Ingrid picked up on the second ring, and I could hear enough of her voice through the phone to catch the nervous rush of her words before Leo asked her to slow down. He put her on speaker without asking me first, which I appreciated more than I expected to. I've been trying to find a way to talk to you for weeks, Ingrid said. I saw the announcement about your engagement online, and I panicked, and I know how insane this is going to sound. But I needed to see you in person before I said anything, because I needed to be sure it was actually you before I said something this serious over the phone or to a stranger. Ingrid, what are you talking about? Your father's business partner, Dale Kessler. Her voice shook slightly. I used to date his nephew, years after you and I ended things, and last month, drunk at a family dinner, he said something about a deal your father made right before he died. about a life insurance policy and a beneficiary change that happened 4 days before the accident. Leo, I think Dale had something to do with it. I think he's been slowly moving pieces around in your company for years, waiting for the right moment. And I was terrified that if I called you out of nowhere with something this serious, you'd assume I was just trying to insert myself back into your life. The restaurant, the shadows. She hadn't been there to interrupt a proposal at all. She'd been trying for weeks to work up the nerve to approach him in person with something she was afraid would sound unhinged over the phone, and a public place with people around had felt to her safer than showing up at his office or his home uninvited. Leo's father, I should explain, had died 3 years earlier in what had been ruled an accident, a car crash on a stretch of highway he drove regularly. Leo had grieved and moved forward, taking over the company his father built, and had never once had reason to question the official story. Dale Kessler had been his father's business partner for over a decade, and after his father's death, had become something close to a mentor to Leo, gradually taking on more influence within the company than Leo, in hindsight, had ever fully noticed happening. What followed over the next several weeks wasn't dramatic the way movies make these things look. It was quiet, careful, mostly handled by lawyers and a private investigator Leo hired discreetly. Someone who spent a month tracing financial records, insurance paperwork, and a pattern of small, incremental control. Dale had been accumulating inside the company for years. The beneficiary change Ingrid mentioned turned out to be real. A policy quietly amended 4 days before the crash, redirecting a significant payout that had previously gone to Leo's mother toward a shell entity that traced back to accounts connected to Dale. It wasn't enough, on its own, to prove what had happened on that highway, but it was enough to reopen a case closed for 3 years. Enough for investigators to look again at accident reconstruction reports with fresh eyes, and enough, eventually, for a mechanical inspection of a vehicle in Dale's possession to reveal something that hadn't been checked closely the first time. Evidence suggesting the crash hadn't been the pure accident it was ruled to be. Dale was arrested 5 months after that night on the rooftop. The case built slowly and carefully enough that it actually held up, unlike so many things that start with a whispered suspicion and fall apart under real scrutiny. I sat with Leo through most of it. The reopened investigation, the numbness that came with learning his father's death might not have been an accident at all. The strange, complicated gratitude toward the woman who'd once been his fiancée, and who could easily have stayed quiet, avoided the awkwardness entirely, and let it go. I asked Ingrid once, months later over coffee, why she'd risked it, showing up that night, watching from the shadows, instead of just calling him directly. Because I knew how it would look if I called out of nowhere, she said. A drunk relative's comment, delivered by the ex-fiancée who might have every reason to want back into his life. I needed to see his face when I said it, needed him to hear it from someone standing in front of him, not a voice he could dismiss as bitter or confused. I almost didn't go through with it, even standing right there. I stood behind that plant for almost 20 minutes trying to convince myself to walk over. What changed your mind? I watched him propose to you, she said, smiling slightly. And I thought, if I don't say this now, and I'm right, he's going to spend the rest of his life next to someone who might still be dangerous, married to a company that isn't fully his. I decided that mattered more than how awkward the timing was. Leo and I got married a year later than we'd originally planned. The case against Dale still working its way, standing this time in plain sight near the back of the room instead of hidden behind a plant. And when Leo caught her eye during the ceremony, he simply nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement of everything she'd risked to make sure he actually got to have this day at all. Here's what this story really asks of us. It's easy to assume the worst about someone standing in the shadows of a moment that should belong person watching. From the edges isn't there to take something away. Sometimes they're standing there terrified and unsure, because they're trying to protect something they no longer have any claim to, simply because it's the right thing to do. If this story surprised you today, I'd love for you to hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. If you haven't already, please subscribe, because we share stories just like this one every single week. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next one.